Hello and welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung. For this video, we're going to move further into the endocrine system. This is the first in a video discussing each of the endocrine glands and the hormones that it produces or the functions that it's involved with. For this one, we're going to talk about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in the brain. And by the way, I probably won't write much anymore. I'm not sure. I do have these videos closed captioned, and I go in there and make sure things are spelled correctly, so you might use that if you're looking for spelling. The hypothalamus is here in the brain. It is close, of course, to the thalamus, which would be up in this neighborhood here. And the hypothalamus has lots of functions that are very important. For example, hunger, controlling body temperature. Our body's thermostat is up in here. And it controls this next gland that we'll talk about a little bit now, the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus can release hormones that control what's called the anterior pituitary gland, the front part of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus also contains some nuclei, or small collections of neurons that have an important job. There's two nuclei up in here that produce and ultimately cause the release of the hormones that come from the posterior pituitary gland. In order to do this function, in order to control the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior, specifically for the anterior pituitary gland, the hypothalamus makes hormones. And it makes those hormones in very, very small amounts because those hormones only have to travel in little blood vessels between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. Those blood vessels collectively are called the hypophyseal portal system. So the hypophyseal portal system is a collection of veins, basically, very small veins that can carry the hormones that come from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary gland where they have their effects. I said they're released in very small amounts. In fact, you can't really test for the hormones released by the hypothalamus in general circulation because by the time they get into general circulation, they've been diluted so much that they're undetectable. So researchers that study those hormones actually have to go into the blood vessels of the hypophyseal portal system and draw blood from there. Obviously, we don't do this on humans because this is deep in the skull. Can't do it on mice or rats because these vessels are too small. My understanding is they do this on sheep. I think that's one of the animals they use. At any rate, let's talk about a couple of the hormones. First, I'll talk about the major classes of them, and maybe I will write this. Releasing hormones. So these are hormones coming from the hypothalamus that encourage various hormones to be released from the pituitary gland. And then the next one is inhibiting hormones. Those would obviously have the opposite effect. They would cause a decrease in the release of whatever hormone it is that's being controlled from the anterior pituitary gland. Just to give you some examples, for releasing hormones, gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. This hormone released by the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary gland to release the hormones FSH and LH. Those are the gonadotropins, the hormones that control our gonads. In women, the follicle-stimulating hormone causes follicle maturation so that ovulation can happen with a mature follicle. And of course, luteinizing hormone, there's a spike in luteinizing hormone that happens, and that's what causes ovulation. So these are the gonadotropins. Oh, in men, by the way, both of these are important in sperm production. So that's one example. I can give you another example, and that is CRH, also known as corticotropin-releasing hormone. CRH goes down to the anterior pituitary gland and causes the anterior pituitary gland to release ACTH, which is adrenal corticotrophic hormone. That hormone goes down to the adrenal glands and causes hormones from the adrenal cortex to be released, especially cortisol. So again, big picture here, what we're saying is that the hypothalamus has control over the pituitary gland, and it has that control by releasing small amounts of hormones through the hypophyseal portal system, and that controls the anterior pituitary gland and the release of its hormones. Let's go back to the posterior pituitary gland. I mentioned there are two nuclei up in here, and forgive me anybody who knows, but I'm not sure of the exact location, so I may draw these in the wrong relationship, but there's two nuclei up here. And we have neurons that are sending axons down into the posterior pituitary gland. This little neuronal tract is called the hypothalamohypophyseal tract. The hypothalamohypophyseal tract. That tract leads into the posterior pituitary gland. When these neurons up here in these nuclei, when they undergo action potentials, those action potentials lead to the release of the hormone from the posterior pituitary gland. Very similar to what we see with neuronal communication, where an axon comes down an axon, and when it reaches the axon terminal, we get the release of neurotransmitters that then cross a synapse and communicate with another cell. In this case, when these axons undergo action potentials, the axon terminals, instead of releasing a neurotransmitter, they release the hormone. The two hormones that are released in response to that are antidiuretic hormone, which has an effect on the kidneys, and the other one is oxytocin. Notice that we've talked about some of the hormones from the pituitary gland, but there's a lot more, so I'll do that in a different video. Again, the major thing here is to understand how it is that the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland via, again, just for review purposes, the hypothalamus controls secretion of hormones from the pituitary gland. It controls the anterior pituitary gland through the release of hormones from the hypothalamus that travel through the hypophyseal portal system and influence hormone secretion by the anterior pituitary gland. And then for the posterior pituitary gland, there's actually neurons that come down into the posterior pituitary gland and bring about the release of the two hormones from the posterior pituitary gland. There's another one that I like to talk about, and if you got the major point, you're probably good, but there's one more that I'll talk about that has to do with metabolism. Excuse me. There's another releasing hormone that's released by the hypothalamus, and this one's called TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. When TRH is released by the hypothalamus, it comes down to the anterior pituitary gland and causes the release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, and TSH then goes to, I'll try and draw the thyroid gland here. There's its little isthmus. Thyroid gland then releases T3 and T4. These two hormones act systemically on the body, causing an increase in metabolism, an increase in energy usage. One of the things they do is cause almost all cells to increase their production of the sodium-potassium pump, and that pump gets placed into the membrane of the cells. And if there's more than are needed, then those sodium-potassium pumps still do what they do. And if you recall, they use ATP to pump sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. If they're doing that more than they need to, there are other proteins that help regulate and make sure that we don't have too much sodium on one side and too much potassium on the other side. So ultimately, those sodium-potassium pumps are just spinning their wheels and burning energy. As a result, they produce heat. So here's the fun story to go along with this. Let's imagine that you're out in the wintertime and it's very cold outside and you're sledding or skiing or something. You may have noticed, if you've done this, that the first half an hour, maybe hour that you're out in that cold, you feel cold, you might shiver, and it's kind of uncomfortable. But once you've been out in the environment for a while, especially if you're physically active, but even if you're not physically active, once you've been in that environment for over an hour or so, your body starts to adapt to the cold and you don't feel as cold anymore. You still know that it's cold outside, but you're more comfortable. Here's one of the mechanisms that help to make this happen so that your body is generating the heat it needs to be in that environment relatively comfortably. Your brain, especially obviously the hypothalamus where the thermostat is, it detects that the body temperature is low. It releases TRH. The TRH stimulates the pituitary gland to release TSH. The TSH causes the thyroid to release T3 and T4. The T3 and T4 increase your body's metabolism and you make more heat. So I like to talk about that as kind of a fun story to understand not just how this works and the technicals of what the hormone names are and the mechanisms, but relate it back to real world so that you can see why this is important. And we've already talked about why GnRH is important, otherwise reproductive function is in trouble, right? So that little last bit, I call those kind of things, why do we care? Why do we even want to know about this? Apart from it's just cool to know from a geeky science standpoint. That's all I wanted to share with you about the hypothalamus, and I'm going to get to work on talking about the pituitary. If you have any questions about this video or anything, please go ahead and submit questions down in the comments below or make comments if you'd like. And thank you once again for watching.